Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you all. I've been following the work from your center and am eager to learn more about it and see where there are opportunities for us to collaborate. So I hope that this can be kind of a first step towards that, and we'll continue the conversation from here. So the work I'm going to talk about today has developed over many years. So there are a whole number of students and postdocs listed here who have done a lot of this work, and also a number of my colleagues. I'll highlight Jamie Cruz because you know her well and she's here, and so I can deflect any of the hard questions to her. But this is, as you'll see, the scope of this is quite broad, so it's clearly something that one person couldn't have done by themselves. So the current government system for managing natural disaster risk in the US has evolved over the years. There have been periodic developments in response to major disaster events, and as our understanding of the risks have changed. And so at this point, we currently have kind of a patchwork of different programs and policies in place. There are a number that serve to supplement the private insurance market, like the National Flood Insurance Program at the federal level, things like the California Earthquake Authority or the North Carolina Beach Plan at the state level. There also are a number of initiatives to reduce risk, including the federal hazard mitigation grant program, as well as state level programs like the My Safe Florida and Strengthen Your Roof in North Carolina. But despite all of these initiatives and a lot of successes, I would argue, the system is still not working as well as it could. I think from any perspective, it's not quite as effective or as sustainable as it might be. If we think about building owners, they tend not to invest a lot in strengthening their buildings or insuring them, and as a result, often have inadequate resources to recover quickly. Insurers aren't super pleased about the system at the moment either, because they find it difficult to make a profit, and there's large concerns about insolvency in major events. And similarly, the government ends up with large unplanned expenditures that become major budget problems, and in the best of cases are a pretty inefficient way to spend their investment typically. So recognizing this, there has been a lot of research to try to understand the system better and to try to come up with new solutions, including all the great work that's happening at the NIST Center. In engineering, there's been development of a lot of physical retrofit strategies to strengthen buildings, as well as loss estimation methods and retrofit methods. Within the social sciences, there's been a lot of work to understand how people make decisions about taking protective actions. In economics, there's a lot of work understanding the insurance market. What there's been less of is a focus on the behavior of the system as a whole, including interactions among these different stakeholders and among the different strategies that we might have. And these interactions are really important, because there's no one stakeholder that can solve the whole problem. And all of the stakeholders have different objectives. They have their own set of alternatives available to them, their own perceptions and biases, and they're working under their own constraints and their own risk information. These are a few of the key stakeholders: government agencies, homeowners, and insurers. So they're all acting in their own best interests, which can be very different. And similarly, there's no one solution that's gonna address the whole problem. Here are a few of the key ones that are related to existing buildings. Retrofit, insurance, and buyouts are all sort of common practices. And again, they're all different. They have different characteristics, different costs. They affect the risk in different ways, and they have different auxiliary benefits. So the work that I'm going to discuss today, in that work, we've been trying to develop a computational framework to help identify disaster risk management policy solutions based on this overall system behavior of how all of this works together. And an important part of this is the philosophy that we've taken is, it's a little bit subtle, but rather than determining what's best for the community and then trying to convince each stakeholder to do what they need to do, we would want to flip that around and say we want to determine how each stakeholder naturally makes decisions, and then try to design a system of incentives and regulations or whatever to produce the best solutions in a way that align with the natural behavior of those stakeholders. The reason for this is that we've started to believe that there's a limit to how much you can be effective when you're trying to convince stakeholders to do certain things if they really don't want to. If it's just not how they think about the problem, if it's not how they address it, I think no amount of messaging is going to get us all the way where we need to be. So if we try to understand these very different behaviors of the different stakeholders up front, and then design the system in a way that, and a set of policies in a way that that acknowledges those, then maybe we can end up with a solution that will be more agreeable to everybody, and what I like to call win-win solutions. I know Jamie likes that phrase. So a lot of what we're talking about is actually applicable across hazards, but our initial focus has been on hurricanes, in particular wind and coastal flooding hazards, and on existing single-family homes. And this is a way to kind of make it a little bit more manageable. But I think, as you'll see, a lot of the ideas could be extended to other types of hazards and other types of buildings. And in fact, that's something we're starting to do. So we've had a number of versions of this computational framework. Each one is a little bit different to kind of address a particular question we're interested in at a time. I'm going to share a description of two of them, just as a way of trying to give you an idea of how these work and the kinds of questions we can address with each one. So in this first version, this figure I'm showing now kind of represents the overall framework. Each of those all cap words are a type of stakeholder that's represented, and each of the blue squares is a mathematical model. And it's a set of interacting mathematical models. We have an inner game and an outer game, so we consider it a nested Stackelberg game, meaning there's a leader and a follower. So the leader is the stakeholder that acts first, and then the follower follows. So in the outer game, we have the government. The government makes decisions. They can do things like institute policies or regulations if they want. And then once they've made their decision, there's an inner game where insurers and homeowners interact. Within that inner game, the insurers are the leader. They decide what they're going to offer in terms of insurance, what price they'll charge, and then homeowners are the followers, and they make decisions about whether they want to buy the insurance at the price it's offered. So there's an equilibrium that's reached there that insurers act knowing with some idea of how homeowners are likely to respond, and similarly, the government acts with some understanding of how the insurers and homeowners are likely to respond. And all of this is based on a loss estimation model, which is something like what you've developed at NIST, the INCOR, or HAZIS. It's that type of model, because all of the decisions that people are making are based on their understanding of the risk, which is represented by the loss model. And then all of the outcomes of those decisions are also going to depend on what the actual losses are. But as you'll see, a lot of our emphasis has really been on understanding these decisions and how the decision makers interact. The loss model is an important part of it, but it hasn't been our focus quite as much. So I'm just going to briefly explain each of these types of models to give you an idea. And if you're interested in the gory details, I can share some references at the end. So the government decision model is a stochastic programming optimization. The objective that we assume for the government in this version is to minimize the expected value of the total loss, as well as the expected value of the tail loss. So the idea is that the government might be interested in both in minimizing annual expected losses, but also the chance of a really big loss that's going to affect, that's going to exceed their capacity to deal with it. And the alternatives available to them in this version are regulating the price of insurance, offering a retrofit grant, and they can decide what should be the maximum amount of that grant, and should they require homeowners to pay some percentage of the cost, and whether to offer acquisition, property acquisition or buyouts. And there specifically, they need to decide how many zones to offer it in and what price to offer. And they're operating under a budget constraint. And the reason it's stochastic programming is because we acknowledge that there's a lot of uncertainty around what hurricanes may or may not occur over the next 30 years or whatever the time horizon is. In this version, we have just one insurer, and they also make decisions according to a stochastic programming. That's how we represent their decision making, but their objective is different. They just want to maximize their total profit. And the alternatives available to them are they can decide how to price their insurance in both the high risk area right near the coast as well as the other low risk area. And they can also decide how much of that risk to transfer via reinsurance. And we assume an excess of loss reinsurance policy. They have certain constraints. They have to minimize their chance of insolvency and also maintain some return on equity for their investors. We represent each homeowner's decision using discrete choice models that were fitted using survey data. There are three different choices the homeowners make. They choose whether to accept an acquisition offer if one is extended by the government, whether to buy insurance, and whether to retrofit their home. And you'll see here, each of these has the form that it's the probability that they'll take an action as a function of certain terms of the offer plus attributes of the house and the household. So the terms are, for example, the price offered in the acquisition, the premium charged for the insurance, and the maximum grant and the percentage of the grant for the retrofit. So this is really important because these terms are sort of the way that the interaction occurs between the homeowners and the insurers or the government, that if the insurer changes the premium, then through this mechanism, the probability the homeowner buys the insurance will change. Or if the government changes the price they offer, through the discrete choice model, the probability that the offer is accepted will change. The loss model is probably something most of you are more familiar with. It's a simulation. We generate a set of probabilistic 30-year hurricane scenarios. We use a component-based loss model and ultimately produce a PDF probability density function of loss for each building, for each possible hurricane, with and without different retrofit strategies. And assuming that this might be an area where we overlap most with your center, I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. The way we represent the hurricane hazard is kind of in two steps. We first develop what we call a reduced set of hurricanes. So each one is a physically realistic hurricane scenario. So we're properly capturing the spatial correlation, which is really important for regional analyses. But we're also being computationally efficient. We don't really have to simulate every hurricane that could happen over 100,000 years. We just need to get a reduced set that kind of captures the variability. And in the process, and then assuming those are the only hurricanes that can occur, we simulate them for long-term scenarios, like a 30-year scenario, because it's important to know if multiple hurricanes are going to happen in a short time period, or if they're going to be spread out. That has very different implications for the overall system. So for the first step, this is just a schematic, but if you imagine all the different hurricanes that could occur, we're selecting a subset of those, and for each one we're assigning an artificial annual occurrence probability in such a way that you can kind of loosely think of it as that hurricane scenario is representing all the ones that are like it. So for each of this final set, we have an adjusted annual occurrence probability, a map of the maximum wind speeds during the whole event, and a map showing the inundation levels during the whole event. And in this case, a set of 97 represented the overall hazard very well. And the way we do it, just very briefly, is by selecting the set of hurricanes in such a way that the hazard curve that results from the reduced set matches the true hazard curve that you would get from a full Monte Carlo simulation, that it matches it as well as possible. So we use an optimization to minimize the difference between those two hazard curves. And then to develop the long-term scenarios, we just take those 97, and each year there's a chance each one occurs. We realize you can have multiple hurricanes in one year, so that the year is divided into 20 time periods in such a way that each time period has an equal chance of having a hurricane, and they're small enough that the chance of one hurricane in a period is negligible. So what we end up with is these 30-year time period timelines, where each year either you have no hurricane or you have multiple hurricanes. The inventory is represented similarly to what most of you are probably used to. We represent the number of houses in each location, I, of building type M, and building resistance level C. So I is census tracts, or closer to the coast, they're portions of census tracts, because where we have flooding, we needed to make them smaller. The building type M is more of the architectural characteristics of the building, like the number of stories, roof shape, and if there's a garage. And then the building resistance level is those structural features that are going to determine damage. So we represent the building as a collection of the key components that determine damage in a single family home. And for each one, so these are the components, for each one we define 2 or 3 configurations. So these were based on physical configuration of that component. So for example, for windows, you could have regular windows or impact resistant windows, or hurricane shutters. And for each of those, the mean resistance is a different value based on the literature. So the building resistance overall is a vector of the mean resistance level for each component. And then the specific components can have different values, but the average determines the overall building resistance. So for example, if you have the first configuration for each of them, you might have building resistance C, and then we can represent the effects of a retrofit as the change from a C to a C prime. So in this case, it would be the openings and the wall are changed from configuration 1 to configuration 2. So the idea of this was that the physical retrofit strategies are captured, as opposed to just saying, like, what if we shift the fragility curve a certain amount or something. They're meant to represent actual retrofit strategies. So actually this is an important part of the system, and I think having a loss model that allows us to characterize the losses with and without different retrofits is really important. Okay, so with this framework, I'm going to share a case study with for the eastern half of North Carolina. We have almost 1 million single family homes. And the kind of questions this would answer is, what should the government do? And there's different questions within that. Should they spend money on acquisition programs or retrofit grant programs? How should they design those? And then importantly, it also allows us to ask the question, how will those policies play out for the other stakeholders in the system? So as I said, like, we're trying to find policies that are good for everybody. So no matter whose perspective you take, it works out to be an improvement. So this is the win-win. So for the first question, the government budget, we're showing here as the government budget moves from 0 to unlimited. And on the left side, we have the artificial case of where you don't allow homeowners to do anything. We can see how the government objective function is reducing as they, decreasing as they invest more. The uninsured loss and the tail loss are decreasing. So based on this, you could decide what level of a government budget would would make the most sense. And in this case, I'm just going to use $60 million for this example just for discussion. So what the framework provides is for each of these stakeholders, government, insurer, and homeowners, what should they or would they be expected to do, their actions, and secondly, what are the outcomes they would expect to experience. So for the government, in the case of the government, the model is recommending policies. In the case of the insurers and the homeowners, we're just trying to describe what we think they would do. So there's an important difference there. But for the government, it would tell us in this case that they should spend $42.6 million on the buyout program and $16 million on the retrofit grant program. And within that, the retrofit grant program, they should require people to pay 50% of the cost and have a maximum grant of $10,000. And within the acquisition program, they should provide buyout offers in 15 of the zones, and they should offer market value. So 100% of market value, not less and not more. So if we look at the acquisition program, for example, the best way to design it depends on how much the price affects the acceptance rate. So if we offer more money, more people presumably will accept, but like how much of an effect does that have? How many homes are in each zone and the expected loss per home in each zone? So as you offer more money, more people will accept, but you reduce the number of homes that the government can afford to buy. So there's a trade-off that's not obvious a priori, I think. But in this example, what we ended up with was it works out best if we offer 100% of the market value and in 15 zones. And similarly for the retrofit grant program, it depends, the way to design it depends on a lot of things. If they make a larger grant, more people might do the retrofit, but they'll be able to offer fewer grants for the same amount of money. So it's, again, I think not obvious ahead of time what makes the most sense. But in this case, this is partly driven by the discrete choice model and how we think homeowners will respond to the price and to if there's a percentage of the cost is required. So that's what is recommended for the government to do. And then if they do that, the outcomes that we would expect them to experience are shown here. So if they invest $60 million a year, the expected annual loss would decrease by $64 million a year. We can see what the expected uninsured loss would decrease and the expected tail loss would decrease. But importantly, also there's uncertainty here because of how we've modeled the hurricane hazard. So, on an expected value basis, it's maybe just over the amount of the investment. But if we look at the uncertainty, there's a 23% chance that the total loss would be reduced by more than that $60 million that was invested. So there's a good chance that no hurricanes will happen or they won't get their investment back, but there's a good chance they'll get way more than their investment back. There's a 1% chance the total loss would be reduced by $679 million. So I think looking at the uncertainty is really important in these decisions. And then to see, do we think the insurance company or the homeowners are going to go along with this plan? We can see, well, based on this model, we think the way the primary insurers would respond is by buying reinsurance with an attachment point of $424 million up to a maximum limit of $3.7 billion. They would make an expected profit of $35 million a year, the same as the reinsurers would. And this would be with the insurers acting the way we think they would act, they would be satisfying their maximum probability of insolvency and a return on equity. And then finally, the homeowners, how do we think they would respond if, so again, this is not telling them what to do, it's just describing what we think they would do in response. So for different government budgets, we could see most people still are going to do nothing, but some people are going to buy insurance only, some will retrofit only. The green represents people who would both retrofit their home and buy insurance, and the black is people who would accept an acquisition offer. And you can see how it kind of changes as the government investment increases. But I think it's important to see that some people are doing these things even without any government investment. So there's these white, red, and green areas. And also, even with unlimited government investment, some people are still not going to do anything. So I think it's important to understand the limits of the policies based on how we think homeowners will respond. But it does suggest that of 83% of the people who did nothing when the government did not invest are retrofitting once the government starts investing. So it's people who weren't doing anything before are now doing something, as opposed to the investment just leading people to switch what they would do. So that's how we think, what we think the homeowners would do in response, and then what would the outcomes be for them? Well, we can see for the high-risk region where a lot of the investment would end up, the expected annual expenditures would go down by 10% for an average high-risk region homeowner. And again, if we look at the uncertainty around that, you can see that the probability of a very large loss goes down quite a bit. So this is the win-win solution. We can look for each of these stakeholders. On the top here, for the government, what do we recommend they do? And then for the insurer and the homeowners, what do we think they would do in response? And then in the gold boxes, what would the outcomes be for each of them? So hopefully we can find some win-win solutions where every type of stakeholder ends up ahead and therefore is likely to support such an effort. I want to talk a little bit also about a more recent version of the framework, just to give you an idea of kind of how it's continued to develop, as we're getting more and more complicated. In this version, we've added the idea of insurer competition. So the truth is that insurers don't have a monopoly. There's actually a number of insurers in any market, and they compete, and that affects the pricing. We've also started to make it dynamic so that we can start to see the effect of hurricanes as they happen. And we're also starting to look at the impact of these policies on the economy as a whole. So not just on the avoided losses, but on the overall economic behavior. So the new models that help us incorporate these ideas are the Cournot-Nash model of insurer competition. It makes an assumption that the insurers have perfect information and they're in a non-cooperative game, but all the insurers are the same. So this gives us an equilibrium market price in the low risk region and the high risk region, and it changes depending on how many insurers are in the market. To make it dynamic, the way it works, just very briefly, is we implement one of those 30-year scenarios at a time. We're making the assumption that the decision makers involved know the history. They know what prior events have happened up till that point in time. And they know the range of possibilities in the future, but they cannot predict the future. And again, the government leads the outer game, the insurers lead the inner game. Just so how it works, we step through time, the government makes their decisions. We simulate the homeowner acquisition and retrofit based on that government plan and update the building inventory accordingly. Then the insurer optimization is run to determine how each insurer would behave. And we use that to compute the overall equilibrium insurance price. And then we can simulate the homeowner insurance purchase once we know what the price is going to be. And then we see do any hurricane events happen that year, and we determine that, update the cash position for the insurer, and update the homeowner characteristics, and then increment to the next year. So there's sort of it's kind of a pseudo dynamic thing where we're stepping through year by year, but trying to start to take that to make it more dynamic. The regional economy model is a computable general equilibrium model, which I think your group is familiar with and has included. So it's a way of understanding the effects of housing loss creates a capital shock, which causes an effect on the GDP. And so we've recently incorporated that. At this point, the effect on the economy is not going back into the government decision making. It's not considered as the government makes a decision, but that's one possibility as we move forward to have the government decisions be geared towards not just avoiding loss, but improving the economy. So to give you a little flavor of some of the new kinds of results we could get with this, if we look at the insurer equilibrium prices, so this is over the years how the insurance price changes. If we have one insurance firm versus 4 firms, the low risk area, that's the more inland area, it doesn't make a huge difference. But in the high risk area, it does make quite a big difference whether we have one insurer or 4 who are competing. We get this price differentiation due to the market concentration. So with a single seller, the insurance is going to be more expensive, as you can imagine. So it depends on how the homeowners and insurers interact and how much competition there is and how the building inventory is evolving. We can see, so this is one insurer on the left versus 4 on the right. The insurers are going to make a lot more profit if there's just one of them because they have a monopoly. But as there's more competition, they have smaller accumulated profits. The cash positions are worse. They also end up with a higher likelihood of insolvency. So if you look at their cash position over time, there's uncertainty because it depends which hurricanes occur. But we've got more often in the 4 firm case, we're going to have insurers going insolvent or bankrupt. And all of this, just as a reminder, is spatial, so we can see where geographically the investments would happen and the different outcomes, how the outcomes would vary spatially. With the regional economic model, though, we can see this is showing over the GDP over the years. And there's a lot of curves here, but essentially, as there's more competition, we have higher GDPs. So the solid lines are 4 firms and the dotted lines are 1. We also see as the government investment increases, we're going from lower to higher GDP. So we can start to see how that makes a difference. So in summary, like the aim of this framework is to try to evaluate and design new government policies that would be better both for each stakeholder type individually and for society as a whole, to determine how much to spend on different kinds of interventions and how to design those interventions. But very importantly, considering these multiple stakeholders and how they interact and multiple kinds of risk reduction strategies that each affect the problem differently. It is modular, like a loss estimation, so we can swap out if we get a better homeowner decision model that we like better, we could swap that out, similar to loss models that we have. I also wanted to use the chance to talk about what we're still doing and where we're heading. John mentioned that we have a new grant from the Coastlines and People program. It's called the Coastal Hazards Equity, Economic Prosperity and Resilience Hub. It's a mouthful. But essentially, we're building on this work, and it's very exciting because we have a much bigger team now who can help improve all of these different aspects of the framework. And in particular, we're trying to examine the role of equity more. And what we've done so far really facilitates that because we're already trying to model each household individually. And so it lends itself to trying to understand then the equity of the distribution of outcomes across different households or across different communities. And with the new economy model, it also is helping us start to understand trade-offs between achieving resilience to hurricane risk and economic prosperity at the same time. So our hypothesis is that part of the reason we haven't achieved more in terms of hurricane resilience is that there are some very real competing objectives that communities have, like they want to have a strong economy. Sometimes that means building in places that you wouldn't build if you were only considering hurricane risk. So there's a whole list of ways that we're continuing to grow and expand, including improving the loss estimation model. And I just wanted to let you know there is a whole collection of papers that's described various versions of the model and various parts of this that I can leave with John or whoever, if anyone's interested, as I said, in the gory details, because this was a very high level overview. But with that, I will pause, and I'm happy to answer any questions or deflect any questions to Jamie.